From Eddie Murphy's secret Bruce Lee impressions to Nick Nolte's hilarious drug dealer mix-up, the making of this groundbreaking buddy cop film was filled with bizarre behind-the-scenes moments that are almost as entertaining as the movie itself. Paranoid studio executives, perfectly choreographed punch counts, and stolen character concepts reveal the chaotic genius behind Walter Hill's action comedy masterpiece. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about 48 Hours, 1982. Fact 1. Eddie Murphy was almost fired for not being funny. Eddie Murphy came dangerously close to losing the role that would make him a movie star, and he didn't even know it was happening. While filming 48 Hours in 1982, Paramount Pictures executives were watching the daily footage and becoming increasingly worried that Murphy wasn't delivering the comedy they expected from the Saturday Night Live breakout star. The studio heads, including then Paramount chief Michael Eisner, had serious concerns that the film wasn't funny enough, and that Murphy's performance was too dramatic for what they thought should be a light-hearted buddy comedy. What the executives didn't understand was that director Walter Hill had intentionally written Murphy's character as a serious dramatic role with comedic moments, not as a straight comedy performance. Murphy himself described the film as essentially a serious movie, where he happened to do some funny thing. Behind the scenes, studio executives were actively discussing firing Murphy and replacing him with another actor. According to actor Chris Mulkey, it was widely known on set that Paramount executives hated what they were seeing of Murphy's performance in the daily rushes. The studio wanted more laughs, and felt that Murphy's more restrained, dramatic approach wasn't what audiences expected from the comedian. Fortunately for Murphy's career, director Walter Hill and co-star Nick Nolte fought hard to keep him on the project. They believed in Murphy's performance and understood that his character was meant to be more serious and street-smart, rather than purely comedic. The irony is that Murphy's more grounded, realistic portrayal is exactly what made the film work and what helped establish the buddy cop genre. Murphy only learned about these behind-the-scenes discussions years later when he appeared on Inside the Actor's Studio with James Lipton. During that interview, he revealed that he had no idea the studio wanted to fire him until long after the movie was completed and had become a massive success. The performance that almost got him fired ended up earning him a Golden Globe nomination for New Star of the Year and launched one of the most successful comedy careers in Hollywood history. Fact 2. Nick Nolte thought Eddie Murphy was a drug addict. Nick Nolte almost sabotaged the entire casting of 48 Hours because of a hilarious case of mistaken identity that led him to believe Eddie Murphy was a serious drug addict. Director Walter Hill had sent Nolte to New York City to meet the rising Saturday Night Live star and see if they had the right chemistry for the buddy cop film. But Nolte never actually made it to the meeting. When Nolte arrived in New York, he ended up at an apartment on 48th Street, where he knew a black saxophone player. Nolte spent 3 days in this apartment, and during his stay, there was apparently a white powdery substance being used that Nolte later described as being abused badly during those days in the early 1980s. When Nolte finally mentioned that he needed to meet someone from Saturday Night Live, the saxophone player asked if he meant the Black Cat and immediately warned Nolte off. The musician told Nolte that Murphy was a bass freak and advised him that he couldn't use Murphy for the movie because you can't go near him. Taking this warning seriously, Nolte decided to skip the meeting entirely and flew back to Los Angeles without ever meeting Murphy. When he returned to California, he reported to director Walter Hill that Murphy was a basshead or crack addict and couldn't be trusted for the film. Hill was suspicious of Nolte's report and asked him directly if he had actually met Murphy face-to-face. When Nolte admitted he hadn't, Hill realized there had been a serious misunderstanding. The saxophone player had apparently confused Eddie Murphy with someone else entirely, or was simply spreading false rumors. Hill arranged for a proper meeting, and when Nolte finally met the real Eddie Murphy, he discovered that the Saturday Night Live comedian was nothing like the person he'd been warned about. The mix-up nearly cost Murphy the role that would launch his film career, all because of one musician's mistaken or malicious gossip. Fact 3. Murphy's acting technique was secret Bruce Lee impressions. Eddie Murphy had a secret weapon for creating intense dramatic moments on screen that he carried throughout his entire career. And it came from an unexpected source: martial arts legend Bruce Lee. When Murphy was cast in 48 Hours as his first major film role, he quickly realized he had no idea how to convey serious anger or intensity on camera, since his background was entirely in comedy and stand-up. Murphy found himself facing a specific scene where his character Reggie Hammond had to walk down an alley surrounded by neon lights and look genuinely intense and threatening. The problem was that Murphy had no reference point for this kind of dramatic acting, having spent his career making people laugh rather than intimidating them. In a candid interview years later, Murphy explained exactly how he solved this acting challenge in a way that nobody on set ever suspected. Murphy decided to channel Bruce Lee's famous facial expressions and mannerisms, particularly the way Lee would look when he was about to fight or during his most intense martial arts scenes. Murphy studied Lee's eye movements, the way he held his face, and his overall physical presence during moments of conflict. What made this technique particularly clever was that Murphy looked nothing like Bruce Lee, so audiences would never notice the influence, but the intensity and focus were unmistakably effective. This Bruce Lee impression became Murphy's go-to method for any scene where he needed to appear serious or threatening. Murphy later admitted that whenever audiences see him holding a gun in any movie throughout his career, he's essentially doing his Bruce Lee impression internally. The technique worked so well that Murphy continued using it for decades, from Beverly Hills Cop to his later action comedies. Murphy has joked that while it might not look like Bruce Lee to viewers because of their obvious physical differences, on the inside he's completely channeling the martial arts master's energy and facial expressions. This hidden acting technique helped Murphy successfully transition from pure comedy into action comedy roles, giving him the dramatic credibility he needed to become a legitimate movie star, rather than just a comedian making films. Fact 4. The fight scene has mathematically perfect choreography. The hilarious fist fight between Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy in 48 Hours was choreographed with obsessive mathematical precision that most viewers never notice, creating one of the most carefully balanced fight scenes in movie history. Director Walter Hill and the stunt coordinators designed the entire sequence so that both actors would throw exactly the same number of punches at each other, ensuring that neither character would appear to dominate the other during their explosive confrontation. The fight begins with Murphy's character Reggie Hammond landing more punches on Nolte's Jack Cates, giving him an early advantage in their roadside brawl. However, as the fight continues, Nolte's character gradually catches up by landing more hits while Murphy's character starts to tire. The choreographers carefully tracked every single punch throughout the entire sequence to make sure the count remained balanced between the two characters. When the fight finally ends and both men return to their car, exhausted and frustrated, careful viewers who count along will notice that Nolte is still technically one punch behind Murphy in the overall tally. This wasn't an accident or an oversight by the filmmakers, but rather a deliberate setup for a perfect comedic payoff that most audiences miss entirely. Just as they're sitting in the car and about to drive away, apparently having resolved their conflict through violence, Nolte suddenly delivers one final unexpected punch directly to Murphy's jaw. This last hit serves as both a comedic surprise and the mathematical completion of their perfectly balanced fight choreography. With that final blow, both characters have now landed exactly the same number of punches on each other. The attention to detail in this fight scene reflects Walter Hill's reputation for creating expertly choreographed action sequences that serve both the story and the characters. Hill was known for his beautifully orchestrated fight scenes in films like Hard Times, and the mathematical precision of this particular brawl shows how even seemingly chaotic moments in his films were actually carefully planned and executed. The fight works both as comedy and as a way to show that these two very different characters are perfectly matched opponents. Fact 5. The police station scene was shot in one take. One of the most technically impressive moments in 48 Hours happens so seamlessly that most viewers never realize they're watching a single, unbroken shot that lasts for 3 full minutes without any cuts or edits. The police station scene that begins around the 20-minute mark of the film was captured in what's known as a long take, where the camera continues rolling without stopping while the actors perform an extended sequence of dialogue and action. This particular scene involves multiple characters moving around the police station, having conversations, and interacting with each other in what appears to be a natural documentary-style moment. The technical challenge of filming such a long sequence without cuts requires perfect timing from every actor, crew member, and camera operator involved. Any mistake by anyone in the scene would mean starting the entire 3-minute sequence over from the beginning. Long takes like this were becoming more common in 1980s filmmaking, but they still required exceptional skill and planning to execute properly. The camera operators had to smoothly follow the action while maintaining perfect focus and framing, while the actors had to deliver their lines flawlessly and hit their marks precisely. The lighting crew had to ensure consistent illumination throughout the entire scene, and the sound department had to capture clean audio for the full duration without any technical problems. Walter Hill chose to film this scene in one continuous take because it creates a sense of real-time authenticity that makes the police station feel like a genuine workplace rather than a movie set. The unbroken shot allows viewers to observe the natural rhythm and flow of the police station environment, making the world of the film feel more believable and lived in. The fact that this 3-minute sequence contains no visible cuts demonstrates the level of craftsmanship that went into making 48 Hours. In an era before digital filmmaking made such techniques easier to achieve, capturing a perfect long take required old-school movie-making skills and careful preparation. The seamless execution of this scene shows why Walter Hill was considered one of the most technically accomplished action directors of his generation. Fact 6. Reggie Hammond's name was originally Willie Biggs. Eddie Murphy made one of his first creative decisions as a movie actor by completely changing his character's name, because he felt the original choice was an offensive stereotype that he refused to portray on screen. When Murphy first received the script for 48 Hours, his character was named Willie Biggs, a name that the young comedian immediately recognized as playing into outdated and problematic assumptions about black men in American culture. Murphy was only 21 years old and making his film debut, but he had enough confidence and integrity to speak up about something that bothered him in the script. He approached director Walter Hill and the writers to explain that the name Willie Biggs felt too much like a caricature rather than a real person's name, and that it carried connotations that would undermine the character's credibility and dignity. The original name seemed to fit into a long tradition of Hollywood giving black characters names that sounded folksy or diminutive rather than strong and professional. Murphy understood that his character was meant to be a smart, capable criminal who could match wits with a seasoned police detective, and he felt that a name like Willie Biggs would make audiences think of the character as less serious or competent than he actually was. Murphy personally chose the replacement name Reggie Hammond, which sounds much more like a real person someone might actually meet, rather than a character created to fit certain expectations. The name Reggie Hammond has a solid, respectable quality that helps establish the character as someone worth taking seriously, despite his criminal background. This name change represents Murphy's early understanding of how important it was for black actors to push back against stereotypical portrayals in Hollywood. Even as a newcomer to the film industry, Murphy was already thinking about how his choices would affect not just his own career, but also how black characters would be perceived by audiences. The fact that director Walter Hill and the production team were willing to make this change shows their respect for Murphy's input and their commitment to creating a more authentic character. Fact 7. The film inspired Beverly Hills Cop's stolen character. Director Walter Hill became so frustrated with what he saw as blatant character theft that he publicly complained about how the producers of Beverly Hills Cop had essentially stolen the Reggie Hammond character concept for their own blockbuster franchise. Hill felt that Eddie Murphy's Axel Foley character was far too similar to Reggie Hammond to be a coincidence, representing a direct lift of the personality, attitude, and street-smart characteristics that made 48 Hours successful. The similarities between the two characters are striking when examined closely. Both Reggie Hammond and Axel Foley are fast-talking, wise-cracking characters who use their street intelligence to navigate situations that would normally be handled by law enforcement. Both characters have criminal backgrounds or connections that give them insights into the underworld that legitimate cops lack. Most importantly, both characters use humor, charm, and quick thinking to talk their way out of dangerous situations and manipulate people around them. Hill's complaint wasn't just about character similarities, but about how Beverly Hills Cop took the successful formula from 48 Hours and simply relocated it to a different setting. Where Reggie Hammond was a convict temporarily released to help catch criminals in San Francisco, Axel Foley was a Detroit cop operating outside his jurisdiction in Beverly Hills. The core concept remained the same: a street-smart black character using unconventional methods to solve crimes while clashing with more traditional authority figures. The commercial success of Beverly Hills Cop, which became an even bigger hit than 48 Hours, likely added to Hill's frustration. The 1984 film earned over $234 million at the box office and spawned multiple sequels, making it one of the most profitable action comedy franchises of the 1980s. Hill believed that this success was built on character work and concepts that he and his team had originally developed. Hill's public complaints about the character theft highlight how ideas and character concepts can be borrowed or adapted in Hollywood, sometimes walking a fine line between inspiration and imitation. The fact that both films starred Eddie Murphy made the similarities even more obvious and potentially problematic from Hill's perspective. Fact 8. Sonny Landham played nearly identical characters. Actor Sonny Landham created one of the strangest character coincidences in movie history by playing two different characters named Billy, who meet their end in almost exactly the same way, 5 years apart in two completely unrelated films. In 48 Hours, Landham played Billy Bear, a dangerous criminal and escaped convict, while in the 1987 film Predator, he portrayed Billy Soul, a military tracker and expert soldier serving alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger's team in the Central American jungle. Despite being in totally different movies with different directors, writers, and storylines, both of Landham's Billy characters share remarkably similar death scenes that seem almost deliberately designed to mirror each other. In both films, his character faces a superior opponent who clearly outmatches him in terms of firepower, technology, or tactical advantage. Rather than retreating or trying to escape, both Billy characters make the same fateful decision to face their enemy in hand-to-hand combat, using only a large knife as their weapon. The visual similarities between these death scenes are particularly striking. In both 48 Hours and Predator, Landham's character removes his shirt before the final confrontation, creating an image of a bare-chested warrior preparing for his last battle. Both characters draw their signature large knives with a sense of grim determination, knowing they're facing almost certain death, but choosing to meet it on their own terms, rather than running away or surrendering. The parallel becomes even more interesting when considering that Landham was part Cherokee and Seminole, and both characters seem to embrace a kind of warrior's code that values courage and honor over survival. In 48 Hours, Billy Bear faces off against the police in what becomes his final standoff, while in Predator, Billy Soul challenges the alien hunter in a desperate attempt to buy time for his surviving teammates. Landham himself seemed to recognize this pattern in his career, later joking that directors kept casting him in roles where he played tough characters named Billy, who died heroically with knives in their hands. The fact that he delivered such memorable performances in both death scenes helped establish him as one of the most recognizable character actors of 1980s action cinema. Fact 9. The movie started as a Louisiana kidnapping story. The movie that eventually became 48 Hours began as a completely different story that would have been unrecognizable to fans of the final film, involving a political kidnapping plot in Louisiana rather than escaped convicts in San Francisco. Producer Larry Gordon originally approached director Walter Hill with an idea for a crime thriller set in the Deep South, where criminals would kidnap the governor's daughter, and threatened to kill her in a horrifying way that would create maximum psychological terror for both the victim and her family. The original concept centered around kidnappers who would tape dynamite directly to the governor's daughter's head, creating an extremely dangerous situation where any rescue attempt could accidentally trigger the explosives and kill the hostage. The criminals would then give authorities exactly 48 hours to meet their demands before they would detonate the bomb, creating a deadly countdown that would drive the entire plot forward with relentless tension. This early version of the story was much darker and more politically focused than what audiences eventually saw in theaters. The Louisiana setting would have given the film a completely different atmosphere, likely emphasizing themes of corruption, political power, and regional tensions rather than the urban buddy cop dynamics that made the final version successful. The kidnapping plot would have required a more procedural approach to storytelling, focusing on negotiation tactics, law enforcement coordination, and the psychological pressure on everyone involved. Walter Hill recognized that while the basic concept of a 48-hour deadline was compelling, the kidnapping story had significant problems that would make it difficult to film effectively. The violence against the governor's daughter would likely have earned the film a restrictive rating that would limit its commercial appeal, and the political elements might have made the story feel too serious and heavy for the action-comedy tone that Hill preferred. Hill eventually convinced Gordon to abandon the Louisiana kidnapping concept entirely and develop something completely different that would still use the 48-hour time limit as a central plot device. This creative decision to start over from scratch rather than trying to fix the original concept ultimately led to the urban buddy cop story that launched Eddie Murphy's film career and created an entirely new genre. Fact 10. Clint Eastwood was meant to play the criminal. Clint Eastwood came extremely close to starring in 48 Hours, but in a role that would have completely changed the entire dynamic of the film and potentially altered the course of both his career and Eddie Murphy's rise to stardom. When the project moved from Columbia Pictures to Paramount, the studio specifically wanted to develop the script as a vehicle for Eastwood, who was one of the biggest action stars in Hollywood at the time and had a proven track record with gritty crime thrillers. The original casting concept paired Eastwood as the criminal character with Richard Pryor as his partner, creating what would have been one of the most unusual buddy pairings in movie history. Walter Hill was hired to rewrite the script specifically with Eastwood in mind, reimagining the story to fit the actor's established screen persona and the kind of morally complex characters he typically played in films like The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly and Dirty Harry. However, Eastwood had a fundamental problem with the proposed casting that ultimately killed the entire project. Despite being offered the role of the criminal, Eastwood only wanted to play a police officer, not the convict who gets temporarily released from prison. This preference made sense given Eastwood's recent success as Detective Harry Callahan in the Dirty Harry series, where he had established himself as the ultimate tough cop character who operated outside normal rules and regulations. Hill completed the rewrite with Eastwood as the criminal but immediately told the studio that he didn't think the casting would work effectively. Hill believed that the best possible version of the movie would actually feature Richard Pryor as the criminal and someone like Eastwood playing the cop role. Unfortunately, back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, studio executives didn't think audiences would accept this kind of interracial buddy pairing. When Eastwood refused to play the criminal role and insisted on being the cop instead, he effectively removed himself from the project. Eastwood ended up playing a criminal character in Escape from Alcatraz around the same time, while 48 Hours went into development limbo for 2 years, until the studio found Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy to fill the roles. Fact 11. Walter Hill uses Torchy's bar in multiple films. Director Walter Hill developed an unusual habit of including a bar or nightclub called Torchy's in multiple films throughout his career, turning the fictional establishment into his personal signature that appeared across different movies, cities, and time periods. Sharp-eyed viewers who follow Hill's work can spot Torchy's bar appearing in at least 4 of his major films, including 48 Hours, Streets of Fire, The Driver, and Brewster's Millions. making it one of the most persistent location names in his filmography. In 48 Hours, Torchy's serves as the redneck country western bar where Eddie Murphy's character, Reggie Hammond, performs his famous scene of impersonating a police officer to intimidate the racist patrons and extract information about the criminals they're hunting. This particular Torchy's is portrayed as a rough working-class establishment filled with Confederate flags and hostile customers who represent everything that Reggie's urban, street-smart character stands against. The appearance of Torchy's in Hill's other films shows how he used the name as a kind of recurring Easter egg for audiences familiar with his work. In Streets of Fire, Torchy's appears as part of the rock and roll fantasy world that Hill created, while in The Driver, it fits into the noir-influenced urban landscape of that thriller. Each version of Torchy's reflects the specific tone and atmosphere of its particular movie, but the name itself serves as a connecting thread between Hill's different projects. Hill's decision to reuse the Torchy's name reflects his approach to filmmaking, where he often recycled elements that worked well in previous projects and adapted them to new contexts. This kind of directorial signature was relatively common among auteur filmmakers of the 1970s and 80s, who would include personal touches and recurring motifs that helped establish their distinctive style across multiple films. The fact that Hill continued using the Torchy's name in films as different as an action comedy like 48 Hours and a big-budget comedy like Brewster's Millions shows how he viewed it as a flexible element that could adapt to various genres and settings while still maintaining his personal stamp on the material. Fact 12. James Horner recycled his own music score. Composer James Horner created one of the most recognizable action movie soundtracks of the 1980s with 48 Hours, then boldly reused the same musical themes and stylistic elements in several other major films, essentially recycling his own work to create what became known as his signature fusion jazz sound. Horner's score for 48 Hours featured an unusual blend of steel drums, saxophones, electronic keyboards, and traditional orchestral instruments that was unlike anything audiences had heard in action movies before. The most obvious example of Horner's musical recycling came 3 years later with the Arnold Schwarzenegger film Commando in 1985. Listeners familiar with both soundtracks can immediately recognize that Horner used virtually identical musical motifs, rhythmic patterns, and instrumental combinations between the two films. The steel drum sequences, saxophone themes, and electronic percussion that made 48 Hours sound so distinctive were transplanted almost directly into Commando, with only minor variations and adjustments. Horner continued this pattern with the 1988 film Red Heat, again starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, where he once more drew heavily from the same musical palette he had established in 48 Hours. The composer also reused elements of this style in another 48 Hours, the 1990 sequel to the original film, creating a consistent musical identity across multiple action movies throughout the decade. This approach to reusing musical themes was somewhat controversial among film music critics, who felt that Horner was essentially selling the same score to different studios rather than creating original compositions for each project. However, Horner defended his method by explaining that he was developing a specific musical language for contemporary action films that audiences had come to associate with excitement and urban energy. The fusion jazz style that Horner pioneered with 48 Hours became one of the most imitated sounds in action movie music throughout the 1980s. The combination of traditional orchestral instruments with jazz elements, electronic music, and world music influences like steel drums created a modern, edgy sound that perfectly matched the gritty urban settings and fast-paced action sequences that defined the buddy cop genre. Fact 13. Murphy was the first SNL cast member to host while still on the show. Eddie Murphy made television history by becoming the first Saturday Night Live cast member ever to host the show while still being a regular performer, but this groundbreaking moment only happened because of a last-minute emergency that involved Nick Nolte getting violently ill just hours before showtime. The original plan for December 11, 1982 was for Nolte to host Saturday Night Live as part of the promotional campaign for 48 Hours, which was being released in theaters that same week. When Nolte arrived in New York City for the show, he was already feeling sick, but the situation became much worse when he got off the plane and immediately vomited on Murphy's shirt. This unfortunate incident made it clear that Nolte was far too ill to perform as the show's host, leaving the Saturday Night Live producers scrambling to find a replacement with only hours remaining before they went live on national television. Since Murphy was already at the studio as a regular cast member, and the audience had come expecting to see someone connected to 48 Hours, the producers decided to make television history by having Murphy step in as the emergency host. This decision had never been attempted before in the show's 7-year history, as the format traditionally required the host to be someone from outside the regular cast who could provide a fresh perspective and interact with the performers in new ways. Murphy handled the unprecedented situation with characteristic humor and confidence, opening the show with an explanation of what had happened and a memorable line that became part of Saturday Night Live legend. He told the audience that because Nick Nolte was too sick to do the show, and since people had come to see someone from the movie, he would be taking over hosting duties. Murphy then delivered the famous opening line, "Live from New York, it's the Eddie Murphy Show." This emergency hosting gig demonstrated Murphy's versatility and quick thinking under pressure, while also showing how his rising star power was already making him one of the most valuable performers on Saturday Night Live. The success of this improvised hosting arrangement helped establish Murphy as someone who could carry an entire television show on his own. Fact 14. The film was completely rewritten during production. 48 Hours underwent such extensive script changes during filming that the movie audiences saw in theaters was essentially written while the cameras were rolling, with director Walter Hill and co-writer Larry Gross frantically rewriting scenes to match Eddie Murphy's natural personality and acting style. The constant rewrites were driven by studio executives who became increasingly nervous about the film's tone and commercial potential as they watched daily footage from the production. Paramount Pictures head Michael Eisner was particularly concerned that the film wasn't funny enough and didn't properly showcase Murphy's comedic talents that had made him a breakout star on Saturday Night Live. This worry led to a chaotic production process where Hill and Gross were writing new material specifically tailored to Murphy's personality, while simultaneously trying to maintain the dramatic integrity of the story they had originally envisioned. According to Hill's own account of the production, they were still rewriting Murphy's character on the very last day of shooting, making script changes right up until the final scenes were captured on film. This meant that Murphy was essentially playing a character that was evolving and changing throughout the entire production process, with new dialogue and character traits being added constantly to better match his natural comedic timing and street-smart persona. The rewriting process also involved adjusting Nick Nolte's character to create better chemistry between the two leads, as the writers discovered new dynamics between the actors that hadn't been apparent in the original script. Hill and Gross found themselves writing material that would take advantage of the natural friction and unexpected humor that emerged when Nolte and Murphy worked together on screen. This extensive rewriting during production was unusual even by Hollywood standards, where script changes are common but typically happen before filming begins rather than throughout the entire shoot. The fact that the movie turned out as well as it did despite this chaotic writing process speaks to Hill's skill as a director and the natural chemistry between the two lead actors. The constant script revisions ultimately helped create a more authentic feel to the dialogue and character interactions than might have been possible with a completely pre-written screenplay. Fact 15. 3 Warriors alumni reunited for the film. Director Walter Hill brought together 3 actors from his cult classic film The Warriors for key villainous roles in 48 Hours, creating an unofficial reunion that fans of his previous work could appreciate. David Patrick Kelly, James Remar, and Sonny Landham had all appeared in Hill's 1979 gang thriller The Warriors, and Hill clearly felt comfortable working with these performers again when casting the criminal characters who would terrorize San Francisco in his buddy cop film. The most interesting casting choice was David Patrick Kelly, who played a character named Luther in both films. though the two Luthers were completely different people in unrelated stories. In The Warriors, Kelly's Luther was the unhinged leader of the rogues gang who framed the Warriors for murder, and became the film's primary antagonist. In 48 Hours, his Luther Kelly is a smaller-scale criminal who gets caught up in the escaped convict's violent schemes, and ultimately pays the price for his involvement. James Remar took on the role of Albert Gans, the escaped convict and main villain of 48 Hours, after playing Ajax in The Warriors. Remar's character Ajax was one of the most aggressive and violent members of the Warriors gang, so casting him as the primary antagonist in the later film made perfect sense given his ability to project menace and unpredictability on screen. Sonny Landham completed the Warriors' reunion by playing Billy Bear, the dangerous Native American criminal who helps Gans escape from prison and participates in the subsequent killing spree. In The Warriors, Landham had played a police officer, so his role in 48 Hours represented a complete switch from law enforcement to the criminal side of the equation. Hill's decision to cast these three actors in villainous roles demonstrates his preference for working with performers he trusted and who understood his directorial style. The fact that all three had previously worked together in The Warriors meant they already had experience with Hill's approach to action filmmaking and his preference for gritty, realistic violence. This casting choice also rewarded fans of The Warriors, who would recognize the actors even if they were playing completely different characters in a different setting.